Last Thanksgiving was the night everything finally shattered. Not just my marriage, but every illusion I'd ever allowed myself to believe about my husband's family, the Blackwells. Even now, months later, I can still hear the echo of crystal glasses stopping mid-clink and see the way every face drained of color the moment the truth detonated in the middle of their perfect polished dining room. If you had asked me then, I would have told you I knew my place in their world. The back entrance, the kitchen stools, the polite smiles that never reached their eyes. I thought humiliation was simply the price of loving Daniel. I thought tolerance was the same thing as peace. But that night, the universe decided I'd been quiet long enough. The evening had started exactly the way it always did, with me being redirected away from the front door like a delivery driver, Daniel whispering, "Kitchen entrance today, sweetheart. Guests are using the front." I'd smiled like it didn't hurt, like it didn't happen every single holiday, like it didn't slowly carve pieces out of me. By the time I made it to the kitchen, the Blackwells were already in full performance mode. Candlelight, designer gowns, conversations about stock portfolios and coastal vacations, all while I picked at food alone on a bar stool. And then the door opened, and then he walked in. Marcus Wellington, one of the most powerful commercial developers on the East Coast, a man whose handshake could shift the trajectory of a city project, stepped into the kitchen and spotted me instantly. And he lit up. "There she is, my boss," he boomed, loud enough for the antique crystal in the dining room to vibrate. Silence crashed over the house like a wave. Forks froze midair. Daniel's wineglass trembled. His mother's pearls went rigid against her collarbone. Every person who had ever made me feel beneath them turned as one, staring at me with dawning horror. Because in that single moment, they realized the thing they had never bothered to ask, never bothered to imagine. The woman they forced through the back door owned the front one. The mansion they flaunted was mine. Their landlord was the girl they'd mocked for years. And watching their faces break open with that realization, that was the first moment in a long, long time that I finally felt the air in my lungs again. To understand how I ended up sitting in the Blackwells' kitchen year after year, quietly swallowing my pride while everyone else sipped champagne under chandeliers, you need to know where I came from and how different my world was from Daniel's. I grew up in a house where hands were always rough, where clothes smelled faintly of concrete dust and lemon cleaner. My father spent his entire life working construction, the kind of man who left home before sunrise and returned when the sky was black again. My mother cleaned office buildings at night, her feet aching, her voice always soft when she kissed my forehead before leaving for another shift. We didn't have vacations or trust funds or lake houses. We had grit, we had work ethic, and we had each other. I put myself through college by painting fences, hauling bricks, and managing rental paperwork for a local contractor who paid me under the table. It wasn't glamorous, but it taught me everything. How buildings breathe, how property values shift, how people underestimate the quiet ones. By the time I was 28, I'd already begun acquiring small commercial properties, flipping them, managing them, expanding them. Sterling Holdings wasn't born out of privilege. It was born out of sweat. And then I met Daniel. He walked into a networking event wearing an expensive suit and the kind of ease that only comes from growing up without financial gravity. He laughed easily, smiled warmly, and looked at me like he actually saw me. Not the calloused-handed girl from a working-class family, but a woman who wanted to build something bigger than herself. He asked me out that same night. I remember how he leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret. "You're different," he said. "Everyone here talks about deals. You talk about building something real." I didn't know he meant it as a compliment to himself, that I was refreshing because I didn't come from his world, because I made him feel grounded, exotic even. At the time, I just thought he was kind, real, genuine. Our first year together felt like a fairy tale. Long car rides, quiet dinners at my apartment, weekends when he'd help me paint a unit or measure windows in a new commercial space. He'd laugh when I explained zoning laws like they were bedtime stories. "You're brilliant, you know that?" he'd say, brushing a fingertip along my cheek. But then came the first Thanksgiving with the Blackwells. Their colonial mansion looked like something out of a movie. Towering white pillars, symmetrically placed lanterns, hedge lines that could have been measured with lasers. I walked through their front door holding a bottle of wine and wearing the nicest dress I owned. Within 3 minutes, I felt underdressed, underqualified, and utterly unwelcome. Victoria, his mother, assessed me the way a jeweler inspects a diamond. "So you're the girl Daniel's been talking about," she said with a perfect smile that somehow made me want to hide my hands. "How sweet." Robert shook my hand with 2 fingers like he wasn't sure I was clean.
"You in finance? Yeah, that is family said."
"No, property management," I answered. He chuckled at Daniel. "Marrying down keeps a man humble, eh?" Daniel laughed. My heart cracked a little. It didn't get better. Every holiday came with subtle digs about my background. Every family gathering ended the same way. Me slipping out the kitchen door, unseen. But back then, I told myself it was temporary. That love was enough. That Daniel would eventually speak up. And for years, that belief kept me trying to belong, trying to make them proud, trying to fit my calloused hands into their silk-covered world. What I didn't know yet was this. The Blackwells weren't testing me. They were shaping Daniel, and he was letting them. Looking back, the cracks didn't appear suddenly. They were hairline fractures that had been forming from the very beginning, subtle enough to excuse, but sharp enough to cut once they finally split open. Every uneasy moment, every awkward silence, every time Daniel looked past me instead of at me, they were warnings. I just didn't want to read them. The first seeds of conflict were small, almost ordinary. Daniel would make little adjustments to me before we walked into his parents' house, straighten my jacket, smooth my hair, reposition my necklace. "You look perfect," he'd whisper, but there was always a tiny hesitation before the word perfect, as if he was convincing himself. Then his family started shaping the way he saw me. At dinners, Victoria would ask me carefully curated questions, the kind that looked polite on the surface but were designed to expose my lack of pedigree. "So, dear, where did you say your parents vacationed growing up?" "We didn't," I would answer gently. "Dad worked most summers." She'd smile with pity that felt more like triumph. "How quaint?" Robert was worse in a quieter, more surgical way. He'd launch into conversations about stock markets, foreign policy, tax shielding strategies, and when I didn't immediately contribute, he'd pat Daniel's hand. "Don't worry, son. Some people just aren't wired for these things." Daniel would flush, not with anger at his father, but embarrassment directed at me. One evening, after a painfully stiff dinner, I asked gently, "Does it bother you? How your parents treat me?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "They're just old-fashioned. Don't take it personally." But I did. How could I not? The first major shift happened the night I overheard Daniel and his sister whispering near the staircase. I had come out of the kitchen to refill my water when I heard my name. "She's sweet, Daniel," his sister murmured. "But she's not one of us." Daniel didn't defend me. He didn't correct her. He just said quietly, "Yeah, I know." My chest tightened so hard it felt like ribs might crack. I walked back to the kitchen, placed my glass on the counter, and sat in silence until dinner was over. After that, things changed in small but accumulating ways. Daniel stopped asking me to join conversations with his family. Instead, he'd say, "You can stay in the kitchen if you'd be more comfortable." He started correcting how I spoke, how I dressed, even how I laughed. "Maybe don't mention your old jobs tonight," he'd murmur before a dinner. "Try not to wear jeans around my mom. She notices. Just let Dad explain the investment part. It's complicated." I began shrinking without realizing it, softening my voice, choosing outfits that wouldn't offend Victoria, memorizing surface-level finance terms so I wouldn't embarrass Daniel. And every time I compromised myself, I told the same lie. This is temporary. He'll stand up for me someday. But then came the kitchen door ritual, the moment that turned subtle discomfort into outright humiliation. The first time it happened, I thought I had misheard him. "Kitchen entrance today," he whispered, touching my elbow gently. "You understand." Understand what? That I wasn't good enough to be seen walking through the front like a real guest? That my presence disrupted the Blackwells' curated luxury? But I nodded, and kept nodding. Every holiday. Each nod chipped something off me. The tipping point, the true root of the conflict, wasn't just the disrespect. It was the realization that Daniel had changed. Or maybe he'd always been this way, and I had simply refused to see it. He began to talk to me the same way his father talked to him, gently condescending, quietly dismissive, assuming I needed help understanding things I had mastered long before I met him. The worst part was how easily he let me take the fall for every awkward moment his family orchestrated. Any discomfort became my fault. Any tension became my sensitivity. Any humiliation became just how they are. I didn't know it then, but Daniel wasn't just failing to defend me. He was preparing to betray me in ways far deeper than words. Thanksgiving should have been predictable by then. I expected the ache in my stomach when Daniel redirected me toward the kitchen entrance. I expected Victoria's tight smile, Robert's casual condescension, the whispered jokes about my background. My humiliation had become tradition. Another dish on the table, served without thought. But that night, something shifted. Not because I chose to be different, but because the universe finally decided to stop protecting their illusions. It began the moment I stepped out of my truck. The Blackwells' mansion glowed like a museum, warm light pouring through the tall windows, laughter echoing faintly from inside, chandeliers sparkling like they were auditioning for a film. Guests in designer coats ascended the front steps with bright, practiced smiles. And then Daniel opened the door. He wore a cream-colored sweater that perfectly matched the house's aesthetic. Neat, polished, curated. His eyes flicked over my flannel shirt, my jeans, my work boots. I saw the disappointment before he masked it. "Kitchen entrance tonight," he murmured, not quite meeting my eyes. "You've been working all day. I don't want the guests to misunderstand." Misunderstand what? That his wife looked like a woman who worked? That my life didn't revolve around country clubs and afternoon Pilates? Still I nodded. Habit is a powerful prison. The kitchen buzzed with activity when I entered. Caterers in black uniforms moved with quiet precision, arranging trays of hors d'oeuvres on the spotless granite island. The oven's warmth filled the room, wrapping itself around the turkey roasting inside. They greeted me politely, more kindly than my in-laws ever had, and someone offered me a small plate. I took my familiar seat on the bar stool, feeling the cold bite of the granite beneath my palms. I unbuttoned my flannel shirt at the collar, poured myself a small measure of the expensive scotch I'd brought, and tried to pretend I didn't hear the laughter drifting from the formal dining room. They were drinking from crystal wine glasses. I was drinking alone in the kitchen. Victoria swept in wearing pearls that probably cost more than my first commercial property. She froze slightly at the sight of me. "Oh," she said, smiling that perfect icy smile. "I didn't realize you'd chosen kitchen duty tonight." I forced a neutral expression. "I'm fine here." Her smile tightened, lips pulling just enough to show disapproval. "Well, Frank will handle the serving," she said, using the incorrect name Robert always used for me when he wanted to belittle me. Then she clicked away, heels tapping judgment into the tile floor. I picked at a dry turkey sandwich one of the caterers had kindly made for me. The stainless steel backsplash in front of me reflected a woman I barely recognized. Tired eyes, shoulders slightly hunched, exhaling defeat like it was oxygen. How did I get here? Why did I let this become my normal? Then the front door slammed open. The sound rippled through the house, silencing conversations, freezing footsteps. Even the caterers lifted their heads. A deep, commanding voice boomed through the hallway. "That better be Victoria's famous stuffing I'm smelling, because I drove 2 hours for this meal." Recognition crashed through me before I even looked up. Marcus Wellington, one of the most powerful commercial developers on the East Coast. A man whose approval could shift market trajectories. And my biggest client. He walked into the kitchen like he owned the entire state. Silver hair, immaculate, navy suit, tailored with clean, confident lines. His presence filled the room the way storm clouds fill a sky. Instantly, powerfully, dangerously. His eyes scanned the kitchen and then landed on me. A grin split across his face. "Well, if it isn't my boss," he said loudly, spreading his arms as though greeting royalty. The word boss erupted through the kitchen, bouncing off tile, ricocheting through hallways, detonating in the dining room. Silence fell so abruptly, the air itself seemed to stop. I saw Daniel in the doorway, eyes wide, his wineglass trembling. Victoria's lips parted in shock. Robert's napkin slipped from his fingers. Guests craned their necks toward the kitchen, confusion spreading like wildfire. Marcus strode toward me and gripped my shoulders warmly. "Good to see you, kid," he said with genuine pride. "I swear, Sterling Holdings is the only reason I stayed sane this year." Every jaw in the dining room dropped in unison. Marcus kept going, oblivious to the explosion he was setting off, praising my projects, recounting deals worth millions, detailing how my influence and connections had saved entire developments. Each sentence was another hammer striking the Blackwells' carefully built fantasy of superiority. I stood slowly, meeting Daniel's stunned gaze through the doorway. His lips were colorless. He looked at me like he'd never seen me before, and for the first time in years, I let him see me. The moment Marcus's words filled the house, something inside me split open, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a strange, disorienting clarity. It felt like stepping out of a fog I hadn't even realized I'd been living in. I watched the Blackwells' faces shift from superiority to confusion to something dangerously close to fear. And Daniel looked like he'd swallowed ice. He was frozen in the doorway, shoulders rigid, eyes darting between me and Marcus as though trying to reconcile two realities he'd always kept separate: the wife he'd ushered through the kitchen door and the woman being praised by one of the most powerful developers in the country. Marcus, oblivious to the chaos he'd triggered, clapped me warmly on the back. "That Burlington project? You're the only reason it didn't fall apart," he said proudly. "I keep telling people, if you want real estate done right in this state, you call Sterling Holdings." His voice carried effortlessly into the dining room. A guest dropped a fork. Someone else whispered, "Sterling Holdings?" like it was a forbidden word. Daniel finally spoke, voice cracking slightly. You manage property?" I turned toward him, letting the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel its weight. "I own property," I corrected softly. "A lot of it." Victoria's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the tile, red wine splashing like blood across pristine white floors. The sound jolted the house back into motion, whispers erupting, chairs scraping, necks craning to get a better look at me. I could feel every gaze like heat on my skin. For years they'd chosen not to see me. Now they couldn't look away. Marcus, sensing tension at last, cleared his throat. "Anyway," he said, adjusting his cuffs, "I should get back to my wife before she sends a search party." He gave me one last respectful nod, a gesture that landed like a hammer on Blackwell pride, and disappeared back toward the foyer. As soon as he was gone, the silence swelled again. Victoria was pale, gripping the edge of the counter like it was the only thing anchoring her. Robert looked as if someone had told him the stock market had collapsed. Daniel stepped into the kitchen slowly, carefully, like approaching a wild animal he'd misjudged. "You're..." His voice failed. He licked his lips, tried again. "You're... the Sterling and Sterling Holdings?" My throat tightened, not with guilt, not with fear, with exhaustion. 4 years of loving a man who had never bothered to ask who I truly was. I nodded once. "Have been for a long time." Victoria made a strangled sound, part gasp, part whimper. Robert's face went sheet white. A few guests murmured from the dining room, uncertain whether to flee or stay and witness the downfall. Daniel stared at me as though seeing a ghost. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered. I exhaled slowly, letting the years settle on my tongue. "I did," I said quietly. "Maybe not in the language your family speaks, but I told you what I did. You just never listened." His brow furrowed in confused panic. I didn't know. I thought you just managed a few buildings. I didn't think that I could be more than what your family decided I was," I finished for him. He flinched. The caterers continued their quiet work, trying to pretend they weren't witnessing the unraveling of an entire social hierarchy. A woman behind me whispered, "Millions. She manages millions?" Robert finally spoke, voice thin. "You own buildings?" 43, I said evenly, across 3 states. Victoria sagged against the counter. Someone reached to steady her. Daniel looked at me like a man drowning. "Why didn't you tell me?" he repeated, desperate now, as if this was somehow my betrayal. I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt something inside me shift. "I tried," I said, "but every time your family pushed me into a corner, you didn't want the truth. You wanted someone who fit into the role they assigned me." Daniel shook his head rapidly, denial rising like panic. No, I wanted to protect you from their judgment." My laugh came out soft but sharp enough to draw blood. "No, Daniel, you wanted to protect yourself from the discomfort of standing up to them." The truth settled between us like broken glass. He stepped closer, voice trembling. "We can fix this." "We?" I echoed. His eyes were wet now. Panic, shame, fear tangled into something fragile. "Please, we can talk. We can figure this out." But all I could hear were the years, all the times I'd swallowed humiliation, all the times I'd walked around to the kitchen door, all the nights I'd convinced myself love was enough. The cracks were no longer cracks. They were fractures. And they were widening. The days after Thanksgiving felt like watching storm clouds gather over a coastline. Slow at first, almost imperceptible, but inevitable. The Blackwells were wounded, cornered, humiliated in their own home, and people like them didn't lick their wounds quietly. They attacked. Not openly, of course. That would require admitting wrongdoing. No. Their retaliation was subtle, disguised as concerns and anonymous reports, the way privileged people weaponize systems they believe exist for their convenience. The first call from the city inspector came 3 days later. We received an anonymous tip, he explained, scanning the lobby of one of my properties with suspicion he didn't seem confident about. Claims of fire code violations. I had the documents ready before he finished the sentence. Inspection logs, dated certificates, video proof of last month's contractor work. He left looking almost embarrassed for wasting my time. But it didn't stop there. 2 days after that, another inspector showed up at one of my smaller complexes. Anonymous report of exposed wiring, he muttered. There was no exposed wiring. There had never been. Then came a flood of one-star reviews on my building's public listings, obviously fake, the kind written by people who had never set foot on the property. She pressures tenants. Slumlord. Unsafe environment. The accounts were all brand new. No profile pictures. No history. My stomach twisted with a cold, steady certainty. The Blackwells were behind this. I didn't want to believe Daniel could be part of it. Not actively, not intentionally, but I also remembered how quickly he fell silent when his family turned ugly, how easily he prioritized their comfort over my dignity. He called me every day for 2 weeks. At first, the voicemails were sharp. Why are you avoiding me? We need to talk about what happened. Then they softened into guilt-laced pleas. You're blowing this out of proportion. My parents were surprised, that's all. Then the desperation seeped through. Please stop freezing me out. I love you. We can fix this. You're my wife. I saved the voicemails, not out of sentiment, out of self-preservation. Because by then, I'd hired a private investigator. He traced every fake review, every complaint, every call from the same 2 burner phones, every suspiciously similar phrasing pattern. All of it led back to one source, a small low-budget PR firm in the city. A PR firm that, according to my PI, had been contracted by Robert Blackwell. My chest tightened, anger mixing with something colder, disappointment so heavy it felt physical. They weren't just trying to hurt me. They were trying to dismantle everything I had built. My businesses, my relationships, my credibility, my name. It was war, and I hadn't even realized we were on opposing sides. I met with my PI in a quiet cafe, the kind where no one looked up when someone entered. He slid a folder across the table, filled with screenshots and printouts and logs, so thorough, even the Blackwells' lawyers wouldn't be able to talk around them. You want to pursue legal action? He asked. I stared at the folder, at the weight of proof inside, then slowly shook my head. No, I murmured, not yet. He nodded, understanding what kind of woman I was in that moment. Not vindictive, but strategic. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the truth. And I wanted the world to see it. So I did something the Blackwells never expected. I went public. I bought a full-page spread in the region's biggest business journal. The headline was clean, professional, and devastating. When family becomes a liability, a case study in professional sabotage. No names, no accusations, just evidence. Screenshots of fake reviews, phone logs of anonymous complaints, documents linking the PR firm to its client, initials, invoices, traceable email chains. The business community connected the dots instantly. The fallout was nuclear. Robert's project stalled overnight. Permits were delayed. Investors withdrew quietly, citing ethical concerns. Victoria's charity invitations dried up. Her luncheon group suddenly changed venues without telling her. The Blackwells, for the first time in decades, were no longer in vogue. And Daniel unraveled. He showed up outside my office one afternoon, pacing in the cold with his coat unbuttoned and his hair disheveled. When I finally walked out, he rushed toward me. Why are you doing this? He pleaded, voice cracking. You're destroying my family. I paused, inhaling slowly. The city air was crisp, biting. It cleared my thoughts. I didn't destroy your family, I said quietly. Your family destroyed their own reputation by attacking mine. He shook his head violently. No, you could have come to me. You could have told me what they were doing. I held his gaze, steady, unflinching. Would you have believed me? His mouth opened, then closed. We both knew the answer. He wouldn't have. He never had. He never listened to the woman he'd asked to marry him when it mattered most. Daniel's voice softened, breaking. I love you, please, come home. We can make this right. I'd waited 4 years for those words, or something like them. But now, hearing them felt like listening through glass. Love isn't silence, I whispered. It isn't convenience. It isn't letting your family humiliate me because standing up to them is too hard. He reached for my hand. I stepped back. Inside me, something settled. Calm, final, certain. The girl who walked through the kitchen door was gone, and the woman standing in her place wasn't going back. People think the darkest moments come with noise. Screaming, breaking, confrontation. But mine arrived in silence. Not the peaceful kind, the hollow kind, the kind that settles around your ribs like ice and makes your own heartbeat sound foreign inside your chest. After the confrontation with Daniel outside my office, I went home, closed the door behind me, and sat on the floor in my living room for a long time, long enough that the streetlights outside shifted from warm gold to cold blue. My phone lit up with missed calls, unseen messages, voicemails I no longer needed to hear. I didn't cry. I thought I would. After all those years of swallowing humiliation, after the betrayal of discovering his family's sabotage, after realizing my husband had never really defended me. But tears didn't come. What came instead was emptiness. A deep, bone-heavy emptiness that made me feel both weightless and unbearably dense at the same time. Like grief had carved out a space in me and then forgotten to fill it. I lay back on the hardwood floor and stared at the ceiling, tracing the lines of the beams I had installed myself years ago. Back when Daniel would stop by the job site with takeout and kiss my dusty forehead, telling me he was proud of me. Had he meant it then? Or had he simply liked the idea of loving a woman who made him feel grounded, a novelty that faded when his family reminded him she didn't fit their world? The questions spun like a carousel in my mind, slow but relentless. When did he start seeing me the way they did? When did I start shrinking myself for people who would never respect me? How long had I been trying to earn love that should have been freely given? I remembered every Thanksgiving I'd been directed to the kitchen door, every hesitant smile from Daniel, every shrug when his family mocked me. How many times had I convinced myself it didn't matter? How many times had I mistaken survival for love? At some point, I sat up, hugging my knees to my chest. My body felt cold despite the heating running. I tried to breathe steadily, but each breath felt like it scraped my lungs. My life, the one I'd built, brick by brick, felt suddenly unfamiliar. My marriage, the one I'd held on to, even when it bruised me, felt like a stranger's story. And I, the girl who'd walked into that relationship with open hands and an open heart, felt lost. Completely, utterly lost. The next morning, I checked the business journal again. My article had gone viral in the local professional community. Every CEO, contractor, investor, and policymaker had seen it. The Blackwells were being discussed in closed-door meetings, whispered about in networking events, avoided in social circles. And instead of feeling victorious, I felt nothing. Victory felt hollow without closure. Truth felt sharp without healing. Revenge, even accidental, felt like a poor substitute for respect. Even the calls from acquaintances, some congratulating me on standing up for myself, others asking incredulous questions about my marriage, felt distant, like they were happening to someone else. Then came the message that nearly broke me. A voicemail from Daniel. His voice was wrecked, trembling in a way I had never heard before. Please, talk to me. I never meant for things to get this far. I didn't know what my parents were doing. I didn't want to hurt you. I just didn't know how to balance everything. Please, I love you. Come home. Home. That word hit me like a blow. Because I realized, with a sharp, almost physical ache, that I hadn't truly felt at home with him in years. Not when I was eating alone in the kitchen. Not when he watched silently as his family chipped away at me. Not when he let me shrink myself to fit their expectations. Home wasn't a place. Home was safety. Home was respect. Home was truth spoken even when it was uncomfortable. And I'd never had that with the Blackwells. Not really. Not fully. My chest tightened as I pressed a hand over my heart, feeling the painful thud of it. I loved you, I whispered into the empty room, but I loved the version of you I created, not the one you chose to be. The ache settled deeper, not sharp, but crushing. This was my breaking point, my bottom, my dark moment. Not because I lost him, but because I finally saw clearly that he'd never truly been mine. Rock bottom is strangely quiet. People imagine it's dramatic, loud, explosive, but for me, it felt like stepping into a room where all the noise had finally stopped. No more excuses, no more hoping, no more twisting myself into shapes small enough to fit inside the Blackwell's narrow vision of worth. And in that quiet, something unexpected happened. I started hearing myself again. It began with a simple question, one I hadn't allowed myself to ask since the first year of my marriage. What do I want? Not what does Daniel need? What will make his parents comfortable? What will keep the peace? No, what I wanted. And once the question surfaced, the answers rose quickly, cleanly, like something that had been waiting underwater for years. I wanted respect. I wanted safety. I wanted to stop disappearing inside someone else's story. And for the first time, I felt no guilt admitting it. The turning point wasn't cinematic. It wasn't dramatic. It happened at my kitchen counter on a Tuesday morning, with cold coffee in my hands, staring at the folder my private investigator had given me. The evidence was irrefutable, the intent behind it unmistakable, the betrayal undeniable. Robert Blackwell had hired a PR firm to destroy my reputation, my business, my livelihood. And Daniel, whether he knew or not, he had spent years priming me for erasure by letting his parents chip away at me without ever standing in the way. The old version of me, the one raised to swallow hurt and call it politeness, might have sought reconciliation, might have explained, rationalized, tried one more time to fit into a family that had never intended to let me in. But that woman was gone. I picked up the phone and called the PI. "Thank you," I said simply. "Your work is done." He hesitated. "Are you sure? You have enough here to pursue civil action." "I don't need the courts," I replied. "The truth is already doing the work for me." And it was. That same afternoon, I received 3 messages from colleagues sharing screen captures of investor forums. The Blackwell's projects were being flagged as high-risk partnerships. Their names were being removed from charity boards. Their social circle, the one they hid behind every holiday, was thinning like a dying shoreline. The consequences they had unleashed were crawling back to them, and all I had done was stand up. The real turning point came a week later, when Daniel asked me to meet him at a small cafe near his office. I agreed. Not for closure, but for confirmation. He arrived early, hair unkempt, tie loosened, eyes haunted. When I walked in, he stood quickly, as if afraid I might vanish. "Thank you for coming," he whispered. I nodded but didn't sit. "What did you want to talk about?" He swallowed hard. "About us. About everything." Silence stretched between us, fragile and taut. He finally spoke. "I didn't know about the PR firm," he said. "I swear I didn't. I would never have—" I held up a hand. "This isn't about the PR firm, Daniel. It's about everything before it." He blinked. "Before it?" "Yes," I said softly. "Every time you let your family humiliate me. Every holiday you asked me to use the kitchen entrance. Every time you chose silence because their approval mattered more than my dignity." His face crumpled. "I didn't know it hurt you that much." I exhaled slowly. The air felt sharp in my lungs. "That's the problem," I said. "You never knew. You never asked. You never looked closely enough to see the damage because it wasn't happening to you." He sank back into his chair, defeated. "I thought love meant keeping the peace," he murmured. "No," I said gently. "Love means standing in the fire with someone, not watching from the doorway." Tears filled his eyes. "I don't want to lose you." And there it was, the final test, the echo of all the years I had waited for him to choose me. But something inside me was calm now, steady, unshakable. "You already did," I whispered. The words weren't bitter, they weren't angry. They were simply true. I walked out of the cafe without looking back. For the first time in years, I felt light enough to breathe. Not because I'd lost someone, but because I'd finally reclaimed myself. Fallout isn't loud at first. It comes as whispers, then ripples, then waves strong enough to tear foundations apart. The Blackwells had spent years building their identity on flawless appearances, generational wealth, and social superiority. But all it took was the truth, unembellished, undeniable, to make their empire collapse in slow motion. They didn't reach out to apologize. Of course they didn't. People who build their lives on pride don't know how to kneel. Instead, they scrambled. The social unraveling began quietly. A few canceled invitations. A charity luncheon rescheduled without including Victoria. A developer pulling out of one of Robert's deals due to unforeseen concerns. Then the real damage hit. Robert's biggest project, a commercial complex he'd been trying to launch for nearly a year, suddenly stalled. Permits that had previously been approved were under review. His investors started backing out, citing reputational risk. One even leaked a statement to the Business Journal. Partnership requires integrity. Without it, there is no partnership. Everyone knew who it referred to. Victoria didn't fare better. Her charity circle, once the crown jewel of her social life, thinned overnight. Her peers, terrified of being associated with scandal, began treating her with careful distance. Polite but cold, supportive but absent. Losing status was, to her, worse than losing money. And Daniel, he was caught between 2 imploding worlds. He called again and again and again. Sometimes just to whisper, voice raw. "Please, talk to me." Other times angry, grasping. You're ruining everything. You didn't have to go public. But I never went public with accusations. Only facts. Facts apparently were enough. I blocked his number. Not out of cruelty, but because the person I used to be was too easily pulled back by apologies that arrived years too late. He showed up at my office one evening after the staff had gone home. I saw him through the glass, hair disheveled, shoulders hunched, face pale. He knocked softly, the sound more heartbreaking than desperate. "Please," he murmured when I opened the door, "just hear me out." His eyes were red-rimmed. The cold outside had turned his hands pink. He looked small, a strange sight for a man who once stood so tall beside his family's name. "I didn't know what they were doing," he said, voice shaking. "I didn't approve it. I didn't ask for it." "I know," I said. His shoulders sagged with relief until I continued. "But you let them shape who you became." He closed his eyes. A tear slid down, landing like a tiny wound on his coat collar. "I was trying to protect everyone," he whispered. "No," I said gently. "You were trying to avoid choosing." He flinched because it was true. He had spent our entire marriage balancing the expectations of his parents against the dignity of his wife, and the scales had always tipped in their favor. He looked at me like a drowning man reaching for a rope. "We can fix this," he pleaded. "Therapy, space, anything you want. I'll change." I believed him, but not in the way he hoped. He would change. People usually do. After the loss, not before. But I had spent too many nights shrinking myself to fit into a life that never made room for me. And once a woman remembers the sound of her own voice, she doesn't silence it again. "I'm done," I said quietly. Not harsh, not cruel, just true. His breath hitched. "Please don't leave me." "You left me a long time ago," I replied. "You just didn't notice." When I closed the office door, I heard him exhale a sob, muffled and broken. The sound lingered in the air long after he'd gone, echoing through the empty hallway like the ghost of a life that could never be revived. The divorce papers were astonishingly simple. No shared assets. Everything I'd built predated the marriage. No alimony. Daniel hadn't contributed financially to my company or my properties. No property battles. Because every deed, every building, every investment was entirely mine. A clean break. He signed without contesting anything. Maybe out of guilt. Maybe out of resignation. Maybe because he finally understood he'd married a woman he never took the time to really know. And then, 6 months later, I sent the final notice. Termination of lease, 30 days. Not out of revenge, not out of spite, simply because the lease was ending and I intended to renovate my property. They scrambled to find something comparable in their price range. They didn't. They moved into a modest townhouse across town. 2 stories, attached garage, basic lawn. Something they would have mocked me for living in years earlier. I drove by once, not to gloat, but to confirm something inside me. People who measure worth through hierarchy collapse the moment the hierarchy disappears. The Blackwells no longer had the power to decide who was worthy, and without their pedestal, they looked painfully ordinary. My own life didn't fall apart. It expanded. Marcus sent more projects than ever. My company grew. I rebuilt my home into a place that finally felt like mine. Warm, safe, quiet. And eventually, I met someone. A man who asked what I did for a living before he asked anything else. A man who listened. A man who never once glanced toward the kitchen entrance. The fallout didn't destroy me. It freed me. I didn't realize how heavy my old life had been until I stepped out from under it. The first morning after the divorce was finalized, I woke up expecting the familiar tightness in my chest, the one that had lived there for years, shaped by quiet compromises and silenced hurt. But instead I felt air, clear, full, mine. I made coffee in silence, walked barefoot across my kitchen, and for the first time in a long time, I felt present in my own life. There was no waiting for someone's approval, no bracing for judgment, no shrinking myself to fit into a table that was never built with me in mind. Freedom is subtle at first. It tiptoes in. Then suddenly it fills every corner. The months that followed weren't glamorous or dramatic. They were gentle, steady, healing in ways I didn't know I needed. I poured myself into my company, not to prove anything, but because I loved the work. I met with Marcus for a new waterfront development, and he didn't call me boss as loudly as the Thanksgiving disaster, but he still said it with the same respect. My employees, my tenants, my partners, they had always known who I was, even when my husband's family refused to look beyond the surface. Eventually, I opened myself to someone new. A man who asked about my projects with genuine curiosity, who wasn't threatened by my success. who didn't flinch when I spoke about the past. He didn't try to fix me. He didn't try to mold me. He simply saw me, the way I had once hoped Daniel would. And through it all, one truth became clear. The Blackwells never ruined me. They revealed me. They showed me the parts of myself I had neglected. My strength, my resilience, my sense of worth. The girl who entered through the kitchen door became a woman who built her own front door and decided exactly who was welcome to walk through it. Sometimes I drive past the old colonial mansion. It sits empty now, waiting for renovation. I don't feel anger anymore. I don't feel triumph. I feel gratitude. It was the battlefield that taught me who I would no longer be. And when I pass the modest townhouse where the Blackwells now live, I feel something even deeper. Compassion. They lost everything because they valued the wrong things. I gained everything because I finally valued myself. If there's one lesson I want to leave for anyone listening, it's this. Never shrink to fit into someone else's world. Build your own. And when you do, choose carefully who gets a seat at your table. The best revenge was never destroying them. The best revenge was becoming someone they could never diminish again.